looking at pedigree notes in your introduction. A pedigree is a visual chart that depicts a family history or the transmission of a specific trait. They can be interesting to view and can be important tools in determining patterns of inheritance of specific traits. Pedigrees are used primarily by genetic counselors in helping couples decide to have children when there is evidence of a genetically inherited disorder in one or both families. They are also used when trying to determine the predisposition of someone to carry a hereditary disease, for example, familial breast cancer. The key that you need to be able to read and create pedigrees. Shaded circles or squares indicate that a person shaded in has the specific trait you're tracing. A horizontal line connecting a male and a female represents a marriage. These two individuals here are married. A circle represents a female. A square represents a male. A vertical line and bracket connect parents to their children. So here's the vertical line and the bracket. If they're all connected to one line and they branch off, then those are siblings. A circle or square that is not shaded indicates that a person does not express the trait. And then here you have your key. Circles and squares shaded in, presence of the white forelock trait in this pedigree, and not shaded in, squares and circles, no forelock trait. That's a white stripe in the hair at the front of the head. Components of a pedigree. Analyzing simple pedigrees. A pedigree is just like a family tree, except that it focuses on a specific genetic trait. Pedigree usually only shows the phenotype of each family member. With a little thought and the hints below, you may be able to determine the genotype of each family member as well. Here are some hints for analyzing pedigrees. 1, if the individual is homozygous recessive, then both parents must have at least one recessive allele. Parents are heterozygous or homozygous recessive. So just an example. If the offspring is little r, then the parents are either big R, little r, or little r, and that has to be the case for both parents. One of those has to be the trait, the genotype for each of those parents. If both parents are homozygous recessive, then all offspring will be homozygous recessive. Homozygous recessive means they can't offer the dominant version of that trait. They don't have a dominant allele. All of their offspring, when both parents are homozygous recessive, will also be homozygous recessive. It's like two left-handed people can't have a right-handed baby because left-handedness is recessive. Note, in a pedigree, the trait of interest can be dominant or recessive. You need to read the scenarios to determine whether the condition is a dominant or recessive trait. Majority of harmful genetic conditions are only seen in an individual that is homozygous recessive, though that's not always the case. Starting off, we're just practicing reading pedigrees and interpreting this information. We have 4 letter choices, A, B, C, and D. And we're going to use those to answer each of these questions. 1, we're looking for a male. Circles are female, squares are male. So I get C. 2, we're looking for a female. Females are circles. That's A. A marriage. As we look back at the rules that they gave us, they said that a marriage is a horizontal line between a male and a female. That's B. Person who expresses the trait, that's someone who's shaded in. Here it's person A. Person who does not express a trait, that person's not filled in. That's person C. Connection between parents and offspring. Going back to the key they gave us, A vertical line and a bracket connect the parents to their children. So D is the answer choice. And how many generations are shown on this chart? So here we have one set of parents, that's one generation. Another set of parents, right? These are their offspring. I kind of draw a line to show the difference. We have 1, 2, 3. These are parents, children, grandchildren. Now we can start looking at a different setup and we can start examining this pedigree. Here it tells us that the path of this is an autosomal recessive trait. What does that mean? That means that this trait, Fanconi anemia, is homozygous recessive. They use the letter F, so that's what I'm going to use. It would look like little f, little f. Anyone who's shaded in, I can just already know off the top of my head, based off of rules of dominant recessive that we learned at the beginning of this unit. Anyone who's shaded in is little f, homozygous recessive. All right, forms of the trait. The dominant form, big F, is normal bone marrow function. In other words, no anemia. The recessive form of Fanconi anemia, little f. Individuals affected show slow growth, heart defects, possible bone marrow failure, and high rate of leukemia. The typical pedigree for a family that carries Fanconi anemia. Note that carriers are not indicated with half-colored shapes in this chart. We looked at some pedigrees that show carriers, and that's mostly with sex-linked traits. So we have to answer these questions down here at the bottom based off of what's given to us in this pedigree. What is Arlene's genotype? Because she is shaded in and because this is a recessive trait, we know she has to be homozygous recessive. That would be little f, little f. What is George's genotype? So George is married to Arlene. We have to look to their children to find this out. They have 4 children, a normal male and a normal female, and an affected female and an infective male. For these 2 children, Tom and Wilma, to be affected, they have to be homozygous recessive. That means they got a little f from mom, but they also got a little f from dad. Dad doesn't have the trait, but he still has the recessive allele. So for his children to be affected by this, George has to be heterozygous, big F, little f. What are Anne and Michael's genotypes? Anne is one of the children of George and Arlene, and Michael is her husband. Well, we know that Anne had to inherit a little f from mom, but she doesn't have this trait that we're tracing, so she's going to also have a dominant allele. She is heterozygous. Michael also doesn't have this trait, but their child does. If their child has this trait, that means both parents had to have a recessive allele and a dominant allele to mask it. So Anne and Michael are both big F, little f, heterozygous. Most likely Sandra's genotype is. So let's find Sandra. Sandra's Tom's wife. We don't know what her parents had. We don't know anything about her siblings. We just know about Sandra. Tom has this trait. Tom can only offer the recessive allele, but none of his children are affected by this trait. That tells me that Sandra's alleles are masking Tom's. And we don't know for sure, but based off of probability and any Punnett squares we can work out, we can say that Sandra is most likely big F, big F. And just to prove that, we can work out a little Punnett square over here. We can do 2 different versions. We can do a version where she's heterozygous. And in that case, there is a 50% chance that the children will be affected by the trait and a 50% chance that they will not. And then we can do the example where she is homozygous dominant, in which case all children end up being heterozygous for the trait, but not exhibiting it. So this is most likely based off the fact that they had 2 children and neither of them showed that trait. List 3 people other than George who are most likely to be carriers of Fanconi anemia. Well, we can assume Sam and Anne are both because their mom was homozygous recessive. So she can only give them the recessive allele. So we'll say Sam and we'll say Anne. But we need at least one more person. So looking at our example, we can find another person whose parent was homozygous recessive. Tom is homozygous recessive. Neither of his children have the trait. That means they both are carriers because they both got one of his recessive alleles. So Daniel and Alan. We have 4 possible people that could be carriers, and we only needed to list 3. Sam and Daniel and Alan. Our next example is tracing an autosomal dominant trait. For this to be dominant, that means all they need is a single dominant allele. So I'm going to use the letter capital N. That's what they've given us in the problem. When we trace an autosomal dominant trait, we don't always know what the second letter is, but we do know that at least one of every affected person's alleles is dominant, and we can fill in that much information. Big N, who knows? Big N, who knows? Big N, who knows? And that's the case for everyone, because one dominant allele is just as good as 2. So the dominant form, capital N, is neurofibromatosis caused by the production of an abnormal form of the protein neurofibromin. Affected individuals show spots of abnormal skin pigmentation and non-cancerous tumors that can interfere with the nervous system and cause blindness. Some tumors can convert to a cancerous form. The recessive form, little n, is a normal protein. In other words, no neurofibromatosis. In this case, the normal version, the non-detrimental version, is actually recessive. So we have to answer these 3 questions. Is individual number 1 most likely homozygous dominant or heterozygous? Explain how you can tell. So in this cross, person 1 is affected, but their spouse is not. They have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 children. Out of those 5 children, 3 of them are affected by this dominant trait. So the 2 children that are not received 2 copies of the recessive allele. For them to receive 2 copies of a recessive allele, both mom and dad had to offer it. So we can infer that person number 1 is heterozygous. That's big N, little n. How can we tell? Some children were homozygous recessive. What is the genotype of individual number 3? Here's individual number 3. And they have 2 affected parents. An affected mom and an affected dad. There are 4 children made from the cross between these parents. An affected daughter and an affected son, an unaffected daughter and an unaffected son, which is person number 3. For 2 affected people to have an unaffected child, In this case, that person has to be homozygous recessive. So person 3 is little n, little n. Can you be sure of the genotypes of the affected siblings of individual number 3? The short answer is no, we can't be sure. But we could give a good guess. Using Punnett squares. There are two possibilities. Now, they gave us one of the parents' genotypes. We know one parent is big N, little n. So we'll say a big if here. This is if big N, little n is crossed with another big N, little n. We could make a Punnett square for that. We get big N, little n, big N, little n. You get a phenotypic ratio of 75% dominant, 25% recessive. And if one parent were heterozygous and the other one were homozygous dominant, we would end up with 100% of the offspring being the dominant phenotype. So things can happen, mutations can occur, whatever, but we're pretty sure that both of those parents are heterozygous. And our last pedigree, the royal family, which we looked at earlier together. The weird European royal family that started because Queen Victoria could not keep her grandchildren from marrying each other. What do you notice about all of the individuals who have hemophilia? We already know that this is a sex-linked trait because we've talked about it. But when I look at everyone who's affected, Leopold of Albany, square, 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 square. Everyone who's affected is a male. Everyone who has hemophilia is male. Who are the carriers for hemophilia and how can you tell they are carriers? First, carriers are half shaded in. Who are the carriers? Females, mothers, are the carriers. Explain how hemophilia was transferred through royal families. Well, first, it was common for royalty to marry within their own bloodline. Typically, this is first or second cousins. Like for example, here you can see that this mother and this mother are both Queen Victoria's daughters. This son of that daughter married the daughter of another daughter. So these people are cousins, first cousins. That's a little bit uncomfortable. And then over here, Tsar Nicholas is actually the second cousin of Alexandra, his wife. And this isn't the only time that we see this happening. It happens really frequently within the royal family. So that's one thing. It was common for royalty to marry within their own bloodline, typically their first or second cousins. This means recessive traits shared by relatives are more likely to appear in offspring. And also, because hemophilia is sex linked. Lydia, it's okay. The trait is hidden in most females. In most females. Okay, there you got an example of autosomal recessive, autosomal dominant, and sex-linked traits traced through a pedigree. Plus, you got to hear some Lydia bark. All right, that's it.